Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
There are moments in television history that don't just end a show, they end an era. 4 decades, British living rooms filled with laughter every time Benny Hill appeared on screen. The cheeky grin, the rubber-faced expressions, the manic chase sequences set to that unmistakable bouncing melody, it was appointment television for millions of households not just across Britain, but across the entire world. At its peak, the Benny Hill Show was pulling in audiences that modern television executives could only dream about. Over 21 million viewers tuned in during 1971 alone, making it one of the most watched programs in British broadcasting history. But fame, as history repeatedly reminds us, is never permanent. And for Benny Hill, the very style of comedy that had made him a global icon would ultimately become the thing that destroyed him. What happened to this beloved entertainer and his legendary show is a story far more complex than simply changing times or shifting tastes. It is a story about culture, criticism, power, and one man who found himself on the wrong side of a rapidly transforming social landscape. The Benny Hill Show didn't fade quietly into retirement, it was pulled, cancelled, and in many ways publicly condemned. And the seeds of its destruction had been growing for years before the final blow came. To understand the fall, you must first understand the rise. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on January 21, 1924, in Southampton, Hampshire. He came from modest stock, his father ran a surgical appliance shop, a far cry from the glittering world of show business. Yet the entertainment bug had clearly skipped a generation rather than disappearing entirely, because Benny's grandfather had been a circus clown. Perhaps that hereditary pull toward performance was always going to win out in the end. Young Alfred didn't walk straight into comedy. He spent his early years holding down an impressive variety of unremarkable jobs, working at Woolworths, delivering milk, operating a bridge, driving vehicles, and even playing drums. These experiences, humble as they were, gave him an extraordinary understanding of ordinary people. He understood the working man, the everyday woman, the frustrations and absurdities of normal life. That understanding would later become the foundation of his comedy, the ability to take the mundane and twist it into something hilariously ridiculous. His real education in entertainment came during World War II, when he was called up for military service in 1942. After training as a mechanic in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, he eventually transferred to the Combined Services Entertainment Division, where he performed for British and Allied troops. It was here, entertaining soldiers far from home, that Hill truly found his voice. He learned about timing. He learned about connecting with an audience that desperately needed to laugh. He learned that comedy, at its most powerful, is a lifeline. After the war, Hill adopted his now famous stage name as a tribute to his idol, American comedian Jack Benny, whose impeccable timing and deadpan delivery Hill deeply admired. He broke into radio in 1947, made his television debut in 1950, and by January 15, 1955, The Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC. A legend had officially been born. The early years of The Benny Hill Show established a format that felt fresh, energetic, and utterly unlike anything else on British television. Drawing heavily from the tradition of British music hall entertainment, the show blended live sketches with pre-recorded segments, physical comedy with sharp wordplay, and innocent silliness with increasingly cheeky innuendo. Hill was a gifted writer as well as a performer, and his ability to inhabit wildly different characters, from bumbling everymen to pompous authority figures, gave the show a remarkable range. During the BBC years, Hill built a loyal ensemble around him. Patricia Hayes, Jeremy Hawke, Peter Vernon, and the beloved Jackie Wright, a small, bald-headed actor who became famous for being on the receiving end of Hill's enthusiastic head-slapping routines, all helped bring the sketches to vivid life. Wright's perfectly stoic reactions made him the ideal straight man, and his chemistry with Hill was something genuinely special. The move to Thames Television in 1969 transformed the show from a popular domestic program into a genuine international phenomenon. Rather than broadcasting weekly episodes, the Thames years adopted a format of one-hour specials that gave Hill far more room to develop elaborate sketches and polished musical numbers. The production values rose considerably, and the creative ambitions grew to match them. The show was eventually broadcast in over 140 countries, and Hill became one of the most recognized comedic faces on the planet. A remarkable achievement for a milkman's son from Southampton. It was during the Thames years that the iconic run-off chase sequences became a signature feature of the show. Filmed using an undercranking technique that sped up the footage, these manic chases, featuring Hill, cast members dressed as police officers, vicars, grannies, and scantily clad women, all hurtling across various locations, were perfectly synchronized to the raucous instrumental Yakety Sax by Boots Randolph. The piece became so inseparable from Hill's identity that it was commonly known simply as the Benny Hill theme. In 2015, it was voted the #1 television theme in a special ITV poll, a remarkable legacy for a piece of music originally chosen almost as an afterthought. As the show moved into the 1980s, it underwent a visible transformation. The most significant addition was the introduction of Hill's Angels, a dance troupe of attractive young women who became a central feature of the program. These performers appeared in choreographed routines and comedic sketches, frequently serving as the objects of Hill's bumbling, wide-eyed pursuit. Their arrival added visual glamour and a new kind of energy to the show, widening its appeal in some quarters while simultaneously making it a target in others. Among the original Angels was Sue Upton, who became one of the show's most enduring and beloved cast members. Interestingly, the Angels lineup also included a young Jane Leeves, who would later achieve international fame playing Daphne on the long-running American sitcom Frasier. For Leeves and others, the show served as a valuable training ground. But for critics watching from the outside, the Angels represented something more troubling, a vision of women as decorative props, existing primarily to be chased, ogled, and laughed at. This was the crux of the problem that would ultimately consume the show. Throughout most of its run, the Benny Hill Show had operated in a cultural space where its particular brand of humor, saucy, irreverent, built on double entendres and physical comedy, was considered cheeky rather than harmful. But British society was changing. The feminist movements of the 1970s had matured into a powerful cultural force by the 1980s. Television audiences were becoming more critically aware. And a new generation of comedians was emerging who explicitly positioned themselves against the old guard and everything it represented. The controversy that would define the show's final chapter centered on its habitual portrayal of women, and one sketch in particular, aired in the late 1980s, crystallized all of those simmering concerns into a single, undeniable flashpoint. The sketch featured Hill in a parody of a beauty pageant format, in which scantily dressed women were paraded, scrutinized, and reduced to objects of ridicule and desire. Even by the standards of what the show had done before, critics found the tone of this particular piece jarring, crass in a way that felt mean-spirited rather than playful. It wasn't just cheeky anymore. To many viewers and commentators, it had crossed a line. The sketch didn't exist in isolation. It arrived at a moment when public patience with this style of comedy was already wearing dangerously thin. The timing could not have been worse. The piece functioned less like a joke and more like a provocation, and the response it provoked was swift and severe. No single voice did more to bring the cultural and moral debate about the Benny Hill Show to a boiling point than that of comedian and writer Ben Elton. A leading figure in the alternative comedy movement that had swept through British entertainment in the early 1980s, Elton was vocal, articulate, and politically charged in a way that felt genuinely new. And he had Benny Hill squarely in his sights. Elton publicly accused the Benny Hill Show of doing serious harm, specifically, of inciting criminal behavior against women. He argued, both on television and in print, including a notable piece in Q magazine in January 1987, that the show's relentless portrayal of women as objects of pursuit, ridicule, and sexual humiliation contributed to a broader cultural climate in which women felt genuinely unsafe in public spaces. These were not mild criticisms. They were accusations of social damage. The reaction was fierce and divided. Supporters of Hill were outraged, arguing that blaming a comedy television program for real-world crimes was not only illogical but deeply unfair to a man who had spent his entire career simply trying to make people laugh. One writer in The Independent compared the pile-on to watching an elderly relative be attacked by a mob, suggesting that whatever Hill's flaws, he deserved better than to be made a scapegoat for complex social problems. Others pointed out the absurdity of drawing a direct line from slapstick television to street crime, arguing that the logic didn't hold and that Elton's stance, however well-intentioned, veered into the self-righteous. Even Elton himself would eventually acknowledge the irony of his position. Years later, he appeared in a sketch on the comedy series Harry Enfield and Chums as a character called Benny Elton, a caricature of his own politically correct crusading, being chased by a group of angry women to the tune of Yakety Sax. It was a moment of genuine self-awareness, and it acknowledged that the debate had never been quite as simple as he had originally made it sound. But by then, the damage had been done. Thames Television made its decision in 1989. After 21 years and countless hours of television that had made the network enormous amounts of money, Hill had reportedly generated £26 million for Thames through international sales alone, particularly in the United States. The show was cancelled. The official reasons cited declining ratings and escalating production costs, with each episode reportedly costing in the region of £450,000. But everyone understood that the cultural and reputational pressure played its part too. The show had become a liability in a way that no amount of loyal viewers could entirely offset. Hill took the cancellation badly. By all accounts, he was hurt and bewildered, struggling to understand why something that had brought joy to so many people for so long had been so abruptly discarded. He continued working, launching plans for a new project called Benny Hill's World Tour, which aimed to film his comedy in the various international locations where his show had found its biggest audiences. But the project stalled, and only a single special, Greetings from New York, was ever completed. In his personal life, Hill had always been an intensely private man. Despite his enormous wealth, he lived simply, renting rather than owning property, eating cheaply, walking instead of taking taxis, patching his old clothes rather than buying new ones. He never married. He proposed twice, and was twice turned down. He had no children. Behind the non-stop laughter of his public persona was a man who, by most accounts, was quietly and profoundly lonely. His health declined sharply in his final years. On February 24, 1992, he suffered a mild heart attack. Doctors recommended bypass surgery, but Hill refused. Days later he was diagnosed with kidney failure and declined dialysis as well. On the morning of April 20, 1992, Benny Hill passed away at his flat in Teddington, seated in his armchair in front of the television, at the age of 68. His body was not discovered for 2 days. Tragically, on the very same day he died, a new contract from Central Independent Television arrived in the post, a second chance he never lived to see. He was buried at Hollybrick Cemetery in Southampton, not far from where he had been born. His estate, valued at over £7.5 million, passed to his 7 nieces and nephews after his parents, the original beneficiaries of a will written 30 years earlier, had predeceased him.